It was supposed to be a peaceful evening at the mansion, a celebration of love, family, and success. The billionaire Ethan Cole had returned home with his elegant fiancée, Vanessa, to introduce her properly to his mother, Mrs. Cole. The mansion gleamed under golden lights, laughter echoing through the grand hall. But behind the polished smiles and sparkling chandeliers, something dark was waiting to unfold. Ethan's mother, a kind and gentle woman, had spent her life building a home filled with warmth. She had never cared about wealth or status, only kindness. But that night she could feel something strange about Vanessa's presence, a coldness hidden behind her charming grin. While Ethan stepped out to take an important call, Vanessa's tone changed. The respect she had shown moments earlier vanished, replaced by something cruel. The atmosphere grew heavy, and the silence in the room was broken by sharp words that made even the house staff pause in fear. Among them was Grace, the maid. She had worked for the Coles for years, quiet, observant, and loyal. She had always stayed in the background, doing her duties without complaint. But that night she saw something she could never unsee. Through the reflection in the marble floor, she caught sight of Vanessa raising her voice and moving toward Mrs. Cole with disrespect. Grace froze for a moment, her heart pounding as she realized what was happening. Ethan had no idea what was taking place inside his own home. To him, Vanessa was everything, a woman of class, grace, and poise. But Grace knew something deeper was unfolding, something that could change everything. She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she weighed the risks. Speaking up could cost her job, maybe even her future. But staying silent could destroy the very family that had once saved hers. And then, in a moment of quiet defiance, Grace did something no one expected. It was an act that would forever alter the lives of everyone in that mansion. When Ethan returned, he would find the woman he loved standing face to face with the maid he barely noticed, each holding a secret that could break his heart. But the truth? It was far darker than anyone could imagine. Grace had been working for the Coles for nearly 8 years. She had seen Ethan grow from a restless young man into a confident billionaire who carried the weight of his late father's empire with pride. His mother, Mrs. Cole, had always treated Grace like family, often insisting she sit for tea after long hours of work. It wasn't just a job to Grace, it was a bond, one built on respect and quiet gratitude. That was why seeing Vanessa treat Mrs. Cole with such cruelty cut deep inside her. Vanessa had entered their lives only 6 months ago. She was beautiful, graceful, and spoke with a sweetness that could charm anyone. Ethan had fallen for her instantly. Everyone around him noticed how he changed, more attentive, more trusting, more blinded by love. Mrs. Cole, though, had sensed something else from the beginning. She saw the way Vanessa's smile faded the moment people turned away, how her words carried hidden edges. But she said nothing, afraid her son would think she was being judgmental. Now, as Grace stood behind the marble pillar, watching the exchange unfold, she saw that Mrs. Cole's instincts had been right. Vanessa's voice had dropped to a whisper filled with venom, words that stung like fire. Grace wanted to look away, but she couldn't. Her hands gripped the tray so tightly it trembled. The other servants pretended not to hear, keeping their eyes on the floor, afraid to get involved. Then Vanessa's tone softened again when she heard Ethan's footsteps in the hall. She smiled brightly, walking toward him as if nothing had happened. Grace quickly turned, pretending to arrange the flowers on the nearby table, but her heart was racing. Ethan entered with his usual calm confidence, placing a hand on Vanessa's shoulder and giving his mother a loving smile. He had no idea of the storm brewing behind that calm. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, Vanessa's sharp words, Mrs. Cole's quiet tears, and the way the billionaire looked so unaware of what was happening right in front of him. She wanted to tell him to warn him, but how could she? Who would believe a maid over a fiancé? Still, deep down, Grace knew this wasn't over. Something inside her told her that Vanessa's secret ran much deeper. And the truth, when revealed, would change everything for the Coles forever. Days passed. But the tension in the Cole mansion only grew heavier. Vanessa had everyone fooled with her charm. But Grace noticed the subtle shifts, the way she ordered staff around when Ethan wasn't home, or how she dismissed Mrs. Cole's needs as if they were an inconvenience. Mrs. Cole, fragile but proud, never complained to her son. She didn't want to come between him and his happiness. Yet every evening Grace could see the quiet sadness in the older woman's eyes. Ethan, meanwhile, was consumed with work. His company was preparing for a massive merger that would determine the future of the family empire. He often worked late into the night, trusting Vanessa to take care of things at home. But Vanessa had other priorities. She spent her afternoons meeting mysterious people, making secret calls, and checking documents that didn't belong to her. Grace once walked past the study and saw her hurriedly closing Ethan's laptop. Their eyes met for a split second, and the look Vanessa gave her sent chills down Grace's spine. Grace began to notice little things disappearing: Mrs. Cole's jewelry, an antique watch, even confidential papers from Ethan's desk. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but when she overheard Vanessa talking to someone on the phone about selling before he finds out, she knew something was terribly wrong. Still, Grace was torn. Speaking up could cost her everything: her job, her home, her peace. But staying silent meant watching a good man lose everything to a woman he trusted blindly. One evening, Grace was serving dinner when Vanessa suddenly snapped at Mrs. Cole again. It was subtle, hidden behind a sweet tone, but the words cut deep. Mrs. Cole dropped her fork, her hands shaking. Grace instinctively stepped forward, offering comfort, but Vanessa's sharp gaze froze her in place. That night, Grace found Mrs. Cole sitting alone in the garden, her eyes glistening with tears. The older woman looked up and whispered, "He won't believe me, Grace. Not until it's too late." Those words stayed with Grace long after she went to bed. She began writing down everything she saw: dates, details, and moments that could prove Vanessa's deceit. Deep down, she knew she was crossing a line. But something told her that soon, Ethan would need the truth, and Grace might be the only one brave enough to reveal it. The next few days were filled with unease. Grace could feel something shifting in the air, a quiet storm about to break. Vanessa had become more guarded, her smile sharper, her words colder. She seemed to sense that someone was watching her, though she couldn't quite figure out who. Grace continued her work silently, every move cautious, every glance measured. She couldn't let Vanessa suspect that she knew anything. One afternoon, Ethan announced he would be returning early from a business trip. The news seemed to rattle Vanessa. She immediately began cleaning out drawers, shredding papers, and hiding envelopes inside her designer handbags. Grace pretended not to notice, but her heart raced as she saw Vanessa tuck something into a silver box and lock it away in the study. Whatever it was, Vanessa clearly didn't want Ethan to find it. That evening, the mansion felt different, quiet but tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mrs. Cole stayed in her room, too weak to come down for dinner, while Vanessa paced the living room, constantly checking her phone. Grace stood nearby, pretending to adjust the flowers, but she caught bits of a whispered call. Vanessa's voice was sharp, anxious. "It has to be tonight. Once he signs, I'll transfer everything." The line went dead, and Vanessa turned abruptly, nearly running into Grace. For a split second, both froze. Then Vanessa smiled. A smile so controlled it sent shivers down Grace's spine. When Ethan finally arrived, exhausted but relieved to be home, Vanessa ran to him, her performance flawless. She spoke softly, acting caring and supportive. But Grace noticed the way her eyes darted toward the study door every few seconds. Ethan, oblivious, kissed her forehead and mentioned he needed to grab some documents from his desk. That was the moment Vanessa's mask slipped, just for an instant, and Grace saw pure panic flash across her face. Grace's instincts screamed at her to intervene. But before she could move, Vanessa quickly followed Ethan into the study, closing the door behind her. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Muffled voices grew louder, sharper. Then came the unmistakable sound of something shattering. Grace's breath caught as she glanced at the locked door. Inside that room, the truth was about to surface, and Grace knew that nothing in the Cole mansion would ever be the same again. Grace hesitated outside the study, her pulse racing as voices rose behind the door. She couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. Ethan's confusion, Vanessa's frantic defense. Then, silence. A crash followed, and Grace flinched. She wanted to walk away, to pretend she hadn't heard anything, but something deep inside her pushed her to stay. When the door finally opened, Vanessa emerged first, her face pale but her expression tight and controlled. Ethan followed moments later, his eyes stormy and distant, holding a torn envelope in his hand. He brushed past her without a word, heading straight upstairs. Vanessa stood frozen in the hallway, her polished calm starting to crack. Grace stepped forward hesitantly, unsure if she should help or hide. That's when Vanessa's phone, still lying on the couch, lit up with a new message. Grace didn't mean to look, but the words glowed clear as day. "The transfer must happen tonight. No delays." Her stomach dropped. Whatever Vanessa was planning, it wasn't just personal. It was dangerous. She wasn't only deceiving Ethan. She was plotting something bigger. Grace realized this was no ordinary betrayal. It could ruin Ethan's company, his family's legacy, everything he had worked for. And yet, the maid had no power, no proof, just a handful of suspicions and her own courage to go on. Later that night, when the mansion had grown quiet again, Grace found Mrs. Cole sitting by the fireplace, worry etched across her face. She didn't ask what had happened, but when Grace mentioned Vanessa's strange behavior, Mrs. Cole looked away with a tremble in her voice. "She reminds me of someone from my past, someone I once trusted too much." Grace didn't understand what she meant until Mrs. Cole added softly, "Vanessa knew my late husband." The realization hit like a thunderclap. Vanessa's connection to the Cole family wasn't new. It was old, buried, and deliberate. Grace pieced it together. Vanessa hadn't just met Ethan by chance. She had planned this from the start, weaving herself into his life to finish something that had begun years ago. And as Grace stared into the dimly lit hallways of the mansion, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The real danger wasn't only in what Vanessa had done. It was in what she was about to do next. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The argument with Vanessa kept replaying in his mind. Her excuses, her trembling voice, the strange documents he'd found in his study. Something about her story didn't add up. He went downstairs quietly, hoping to clear his head, but stopped when he saw a light coming from the study. The door was slightly open, and inside stood Vanessa, frantically rummaging through his desk drawers, stuffing papers into her handbag. "Vanessa?" His voice cut through the silence. She froze. Slowly, she turned around, her face pale, her hands shaking. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan stepped forward, holding the torn envelope from earlier. "You lied to me," he said quietly, hurt more than angry. "All this time you've been pretending." Vanessa tried to keep her composure, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not what you think," she whispered, but her voice cracked. "I had no choice." Ethan's confusion deepened, and before he could respond, Grace appeared at the doorway, clutching the silver box she had found hidden behind a painting. "You mean this?" Grace asked, setting it on the desk. Ethan opened it, revealing stacks of forged contracts, fake transfer documents, and, most shocking of all, letters between Vanessa and his late father's former business partner. The truth hit him like a wave. Vanessa hadn't just been manipulating him, she had been continuing a scheme started years ago to take over the Cole family's assets from the inside. But before Ethan could react, Vanessa broke down, sobbing. "I didn't want this anymore," she cried. "They threatened me. I was in too deep." Her voice trembled with real fear. For the first time, Ethan saw not a villain, but a desperate woman caught in her own trap. Mrs. Cole entered quietly, leaning against the doorframe. "I knew you looked familiar," she said softly. "Your mother once worked for my husband. She blamed us when he left her with nothing." The room fell into stunned silence. Vanessa lowered her head, ashamed. Ethan took a long breath. The betrayal hurt, but the hatred in Vanessa's story ran deeper than greed. It was revenge born out of pain. And just when it seemed like everything was coming to light, a knock came at the door. Two men in dark suits entered, flashing badges. "Ms. Vanessa Moore?" one of them said. "We need to ask you some questions." As Vanessa was led away, she looked back at Ethan with tears in her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. But the truth had already done its damage, and the night's revelations weren't over yet. The next morning, the house felt heavier than ever. The sound of the front door closing as the officers took Vanessa away still echoed in Ethan's mind. He sat at the dining table, staring at his untouched coffee, lost in thought. His mother quietly joined him, her hands trembling slightly as she poured herself a cup. "You did the right thing," she said softly, but Ethan didn't answer. His heart felt torn between anger and sadness. Grace walked in next, her eyes tired but calm. She placed a small envelope on the table. "This was in Vanessa's room," she said quietly. Inside was a handwritten note addressed to Ethan. It wasn't long, just an apology, explaining that she had been trapped by people who once worked for his father, forced to manipulate him to repay debts she never truly owed. She wrote that she had fallen in love with him despite everything, but couldn't find a way out before it was too late. Ethan read it twice, then folded it carefully. "I don't know whether to believe her or not," he whispered. Grace looked at him gently. "Maybe it doesn't matter now," she said. "What matters is what you do next." The following weeks were slow but healing. The scandal made headlines briefly. The billionaire betrayed by his fiancée. But Ethan avoided interviews and stayed focused on rebuilding trust within his company. His mother slowly recovered, finding comfort in small things like gardening and evening walks. Grace stayed by their side, quietly helping around the house, though now Ethan made sure she was treated not as a maid, but as family. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the estate, Ethan joined Grace and his mother on the porch. The air felt calm for the first time in months. "You know," Mrs. Cole said with a small smile, "sometimes pain uncovers truth we never knew we needed." Ethan nodded, glancing at Grace, who smiled back faintly. In time, the mansion that once echoed with tension began to feel like home again. The lessons stayed with Ethan: the danger of blind trust, the strength of forgiveness, and the quiet power of kindness. He realized that wealth could rebuild walls, but only honesty and compassion could rebuild hearts. As the night settled, Grace looked toward the stars and whispered, "Maybe some people come into our lives just to teach us something." Ethan smiled, finally at peace. "Then she taught me everything I needed to know," he said softly, as the lights of the house glowed warmly behind them, marking the beginning of a quieter, wiser chapter in their lives.